Okay, so welcome everybody for this sixth CMS book discussion. And today we have with us Dr. Michiel Baas from Germany, and he would be talking about his book Muscular India. And I'm very much delighted to welcome him for this discussion and also all other participants. So what we would follow is a kind of an introduction, and we had Dr. Nicholas Lacra, who is the coordinator of CMS department. Unfortunately, he's not well, so he won't be joining today, but he has conveyed his regards, best wishes to Michelle and for this session. And I'm very much excited to present before you, Michelle, and the book, because this is a book which I have also read and I have a copy of it. And I have read from first page to the last page, and it's a quite interesting book about the urban India, about the gym trainers, about the bodybuilders, their aspirations, their dreams, and a new urban India. So today we have with us Mehul Agarwal as well, who is a PhD scholar in our department, who is working on masculinity and media, and he would be moderating the session. So over to you, Mehul.
Thank you, Pranta sir. Good evening, one and all. Welcome to the sixth CMS book discussion series organized by the Department of Culture and Media Studies, Central University of Rajasthan. Our esteemed guest for the day is Dr. Michiel Baas from Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, who will discuss his views and arguments based on his authored book titled Muscular India, Masculinity, Mobility, and the New Middle Class, published by Context. Before we begin, I would like to mention that this session is now being recorded. So the participants are requested to keep their microphones off during the sessions. And our esteemed speaker would be speaking for approximately 30 minutes, followed by the question answer session from the participants who may unmute themselves and ask the questions or may type their queries along with their name and institutional affiliation in the chat box. I now request Dr. Neeru Prasad, Assistant Professor, CMS Department, to introduce our speaker for the day to the participants. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mehul, and I welcome Michiel Baas in our book discussion. And I would like to introduce about Michiel Baas. Michiel Baas is associated with Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, Germany. He has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Amsterdam and has held various academic positions with the National University of Singapore, Nalanda University, the International Institute for Asian Studies, and the University of Amsterdam. Most of his work centers on the Indian middle class. He has published extensively on the topic of fitness and bodybuilding in India, student migration to Australia, the migration trajectories for skilled professionals in Singapore, the Indian migration industry, and the lives and lifestyles of IT professionals in Bangalore. So, Mr. Michiel Baas, I welcome you in this session. Thank you very much for coming and sparing your time for interacting with us. So, Mehul, this is over to you now.
Thank you, ma'am. Without any further delay, we would like to invite our speaker for today's session. We are eager to hear from you, sir. So now, if you would take over. Sir, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. So that was my question. Can I see some thumbs to see if people can hear me properly? And I think so. Yeah. Right.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Neeru, Mehul, and Pranta for this lovely introduction, as well as for the invitation to discuss my book. It's a great honor. Very happy to meet you here. These were weird circumstances where more than a year ago, I was already hoping to return to India at some point, but it still hasn't been possible. And hopefully it is actually around next year. So perhaps we can then meet in person. So I've prepared a presentation of about 40 minutes. You need to tell me if if I'm testing your patience with speaking too long. Let me see if I, because I'm not too used to. this one. I'm more used to Zoom. Everything is through Zoom now. How I can share my presentation. I'm so sorry if this is taking present now. I think
Present now, yeah.
Your entire screen. That's what's going to happen. And then, oh no, this is not the one.
You have to present your window.
Oh, window. Okay.
Yeah.
And why is it not giving me my presentation?
Your PPT has to be there. You don't have to minimize your PPT. Open the PPT tab and then switch to this tab, and then you present the window.
Right, let me try again. Sorry about this. It might be a bit too clumsy. Yes, I see. Can you now see my presentation?
No. Yes. Now it's coming.
Yeah, it is there?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
All right, so this is me. Well, definitely not me there on the cover. This is actually an informant of mine from Bangalore. And the picture that dons the cover is one that was taken by a locally based artist, Kop Shiva, for a different project. But it kind of sort of in a very brief way, illustrates what I'll be talking about here. The guy you see here in the front is Abhishek. He's a bodybuilder, Bangalore-based bodybuilder and fitness trainer. And you see him posing in front of one of Bangalore's famous murals. And some of you who are familiar with Bangalore know that. Can you hear me, or is that an issue?
No, sir, we can hear you perfectly.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought something was happening. So the thing to know about the picture is that, the mural he's posing in front of was created for beautification purposes. This is a strategy that is not unknown to Bangalore nor to other Indian cities, partly as a way to kind of sort of do something with all the concrete, all the building sites around. But the one thing that really captured my attention is the way the tiger seems to be attacking him from behind. But at the same time, he doesn't care. The city is his, and he's more than willing to pose in his underwear in a very public situation because he's exceptionally proud of his body. And this picture was selected for the book cover long after I'd finished my research, but it kind of captures a particular, I guess, predicament about lower middle classness and upward mobility, and the way those higher up the ladder reflect on people lower up the ladder, and how one needs to face kind of complications with that. So that's a little bit what I'll be speaking about here, because it captures the book really well. This is me. I am actually originally from the Netherlands. I did my PhD with the University of Amsterdam in 2009. I'm an anthropologist. I spent a long time of my career looking into various types of migration, most notably the topic of student migration from India to Australia, which was also the topic of my PhD and the topic of my first book, which you see here down below, called Imagined Mobility, and which looks at migration and transnationalism among Indian students in Australia. A kind of an overarching theme in my current work, as well as my past work, has always been the Indian middle class. And already in my work as a master's student, I looked into the IT industry located in Bangalore, and in particular into local and global intersections in the lives of IT professionals working for companies such as Infosys and Wipro and otherwise. In 2012, I moved to Singapore, and I started working for the Asia Research Institute, which is part of the National University of Singapore. And there I was part of the migration cluster. And in that role, I did various researches in the field of the migration industry, as located in the greater Chennai region, as well as skilled migration from India to Singapore. Then in 2020, I joined the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. It was located in the small and quaint town of Halle in Germany, in East Germany, about an hour and 15 minutes from Berlin by train. And I'm currently in the process of developing an anthropology of artificial intelligence, so quite different from what I've been doing earlier. You'll see here some of my publications in the field of migration studies. Won't be saying all that much about here because the focus is something else, but I just thought I'd flag it to give you an idea of the different topics I've been working on. And if any of you are interested in these topics, I'm more than welcome you to write to me. And if you can't access any of these publications, I always have PDFs to share, because some of them came out with university presses that ask rather exorbitant fees for that books, which, if you ask me, should be dealt with. But anyway, here you see some further publications as well as some journals where you can find my work in. So from migration studies, I gradually started working more on the topic of the body, as well as gender, sexuality, and related issues, as they kind of became part of my study, my long-term study into the emergence of new bodily ideals in India, as well as the kind of emergence of the fitness industry and the profession of fitness trainer, the popularity of bodybuilding as a professional sports, etc. So before I start talking about my book, the one question that I always get asked, and I've been asked repeatedly over the years, is how I came to do research on this topic. Like, what actually triggered me to become interested in this field, and what actually made me stay with that topic for roughly a decade, because I've been fascinated by it, looking into gathering material for about a decade now, more than a decade. And on the left here, you see a picture of a very modern gym. It's just something I randomly found on the internet, but you can find it now all over urban India. This is such a ubiquitous presence. There are gyms all over, but they weren't actually all there. In fact, the whole phenomena is fairly recent. When I was looking into the IT industry in Bangalore in 2003, there were barely any gyms around in urban India. The only place where you would find them in Bangalore was on these IT campuses of Infosys and Wipro. They had American-style gyms, and some of the IT professionals that I met would go there regularly to work on their health. But the whole thing was in a certain infancy. It didn't quite speak to the masses in the way it does now. In the middle, you see a picture of a bodybuilding competition. It's a picture from a competition held in Tamil Nadu from 2017. I don't actually recall precisely which one it is, but more and more we see competitions, even at the most local, regional level, having multiple avatars. So you could go to Coimbatore and have like 3 different competitions running in the same period, all vying to select the Mr. Coimbatore. And I kind of like to use these pictures also as a way of thinking, like, how did we get from that momentum where there were barely any gyms around to that momentum where even a regional city in Tamil Nadu, like Coimbatore or Salem, or for that matter, Rajasthan, Jaipur, Udaipur, or smaller, might have multiple competitions running, trying to find the next Mr. something. So if you want to understand that momentum, that popularity of fitness, as I argue in the book, you need to go back to 2007, and in particular to the movie Om Shanti Om, which I probably don't need to say anything about, because any person who's grown up in India, who was around at the time, will recall this movie, and it's still probably one of the most iconic ones that Shah Rukh Khan performed in. But it isn't just iconic for its famous songs and the entire way that it brought together kind of this joy for Bollywood, but also how there was this momentum in the song Dada Disco, where Shah Rukh Khan revealed what the media started calling very quickly as freshly baked abs. And this is a kind of sort of a phrasing that stayed, that colors kind of discussions about Indian actors till this day. This idea of freshly baked abs, this bulging biceps, but also in feeling them. Like in a movie like Om Shanti Om, this was the first movie to really do that. The moment is chosen very strategically to unveil this. The popularity of fitness was really sealed with Amar Khan's performance in Ghajini a year later, where he showed this incredible transformation, even more so than in Om Shanti Om, the transformation itself became a kind of sort of a by-story to the movie. The movie, of course, was immensely successful. It's actually a remake of a Tamil movie, which itself is a remake of an American movie called Memento. But besides the storyline, which really captivated audiences, there were really two things that really captivated the audiences otherwise. One, of course, was his physical transformation. The other thing was the kind of scar haircut. And you may recall that actually that became popular for a while. Well, the haircut has disappeared, the body hasn't. This idea of transformation really speaks to a bigger issue, which I'll be coming back to later. Around this time, India's edition of Men's Health also was published for the first time. And I think this added to this idea of it being possible to build a body like that of Shah Rukh Khan, of Amir Khan, and of course of so many other actors who would follow, who would do so simultaneously. But obviously, it was not the first time that a Bollywood movie actually did that. If you go back to Salman Khan's 1998 movie, Pyar Kiya Dana Kiya, that already played with notions of muscularity. But what was absent in these earlier movies was this notion of transformation and its linkage to a kind of middle-class belonging. And that's where my book starts, what my book starts with. So who are these men that I speak about in my book? And you see three different informants here. They're most of all making their money through offering fitness training, personal training. And besides that, many of them are also active as bodybuilders. But bodybuilding itself is no longer just about showing enormous muscles. There are many forms, many different types of bodybuilding competitions, ranging from the more classical ones that are all about immense muscularity. If you, for instance, look at the guy on the left, to kind of sort of more fitness modeling or beach modeling, male modeling, as you see in the middle. So there's actually quite a diversity in terms of competitions. Besides that, the men I interviewed are very proud of their bodies. Of course, these bodies are also very much necessary for their professions, not just in terms of being able to do what they do, but also very much in terms of being able to appeal to upper middle class customers who buy their services to work on their own bodies. And this is mainly in terms of weight loss, managing healthier lifestyles, and occasionally also the dream of looking like actors, models, etc. Almost all of my informants are out of lower middle class and or vernacular backgrounds. And this is kind of a concept that I work with a lot. One of my interests about the middle class is understanding how it is layered. If you think of the middle class as maybe roughly 300, 400 million people strong, then what are the internal differences and how do these different groups relate to each other? How is it composed? There is a large group of new middle class people who are, in terms of generations, in terms of parents and their grandparents, newcomers to middle class ranks. At the same time, there is obviously an older middle class, often English speaking, who often also act as gatekeepers in terms of middle classness. And this is something I'm particularly interested in, how these different groups relate to each other and how one then makes one way up the economic, social, and cultural ladder. So I look at that through the notion of mobility. In my research, what constantly presented itself as a question was, what is it that these men offer that might appeal upper middle class clients to pay for their services? What is it precisely that provokes people to go to the gym and then buy into expensive services to potentially emulate a bodily model of which we all know it is excessively hard to achieve? It is really not that simple to become, in 60 days, as presented here on the left, from one body ideal to another, let alone become a full-on bodybuilder in the way you see here to the right. whatever you may think about their accomplishments in terms of anabolic steroids or growth hormones, it takes years and years and years of dedicated hard work to achieve what they have. And in that sense, they are truly athletes. There is no denying that. So obviously, when an average human being like me steps into the gym and wants to look like the guy here on the left, it's going to take years and years of dedicated hard work, which few of us have the time and energy for, let alone the dedication. So what beyond that is what a fitness trainer offers. This stayed with me as a question throughout my research and throughout my conversations with fitness trainers, asking them what it is that you think that your client looks into you. And one thing that stood out is that many of them, beyond sort of immediately being instructors in the gym, also operate as lifestyle coaches. The gym floor is a perfect place to have a conversation. You're often out of breath. You want to have half a minute more to regain your strength. And all these moments offer opportunities to talk. And the gym is often also thought as a kind of safe space where you can easily share your experiences, and clients do so rather freely. But at the same time, that is characterized by a certain amount of power relations, where my informants come from a certain background that contrasted with their clients whose lifestyles they emulated themselves. And the currency they bring to the table is their bodies themselves. It's their muscles that opens the door and that makes it partly, temporarily, and spatially possible to climb the ladder of middle classness. So it was typically also this that through such explorations that I circled back to questions about what this body itself is about. I've already talked a little bit about Bollywood, and you'll have to excuse me that I often come back to Bollywood being the most iconic, but this is not a trend that in the end didn't influence India's many other movie industries as well, ranging from Collywood to Tollywood to Sandalwood. It's been something that has triggered throughout, maybe with some delay, but in the end, the movie industry across India was impacted by this expectation, not just expectation of male heroes to showcase bodily transformation, but also in terms of the way it is layered. And this layering of the body I'm particularly interested in. As you see here on the left, you see a cover of Men's Health India. The magazine has folded a few years ago for not entirely clear reasons, but I remember an interview once with the lead editor, the one who actually brought the magazine. It's an internationally popular magazine. It's available all over the world in local editions, from South Korea to the Netherlands to the US. And I asked him what the reaction was to the first magazine. And at the time, Men's Health was part of the India Today group. And this editor, Jamal Sheikh, he told me that the moment the magazine came out, his boss called him up and he said, "Why did you use a foreign model on the cover when we are launching the Indian edition of Men's Health?" And he said, "No, we're not. This is a local model." And he said his boss could not imagine that Indians were capable of six-pack abs. And I thought that was really interesting. It interested him as well, because he said that became a unique selling point of the magazine itself, to convey that this was also possible on an Indian diet, in India itself, with an Indian body. So all of these things became kind of sort of localized. They became an emergent narrative on the body that had very deep local roots. And if you look at magazines like Men's Health, there are many others that do that. You see that it isn't just an attractive body or an aesthetically pleasing body, but it's also a body that gets layered in terms of various ways, from cosmopolitanism to professionalism to being a body that is about being a professional with a company and still living a healthy life. And if you then look at the 3 pictures that follow, you see also kind of sort of different interpretations of a muscular body that we all think of muscular, whether it's Ranveer in a movie showcasing a particular muscularity and having that folded into a Romeo and Juliet story that's situated in a make-believe Gujarat, or it's a body that is capable of competing at an international level, as you see in the 3rd picture, or a body that becomes sexually attractive to a same-sex audience and that is sold through Instagram and OnlyFans websites. But in all these cases, this is a body that isn't just about just being a functional body. It's also a body that communicates a story. And in many ways, as I've pointed out throughout my book, a body that references the idea of a new India and of urban change. Somebody needs to tell me if I'm running out of time. Am I okay?
Perfect. Yeah. Continue.
Okay. How much more time do I have?
Michel, you have 10-15 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, right. Perfect. So I'm getting there. So the moment you start looking into something like this, you need to think through also how has this body existed before. It's insane to suggest that the muscular body is just a recent phenomenon. I mean, muscularity as part of masculine identities or as part of what it means to be a male has a long and deeply rooted in history in India and in South Asia. So one thing that the book talks about a little bit is, on the one hand, how this new kind of body, as we see it in Bollywood and we see it in the fitness gym, in the gym itself, resonates, but also deviates from older ideas. And for that, I started looking into Pehlavani and Kushti wrestling, which I think is probably what most will have a familiarity with, but also the way the body, the ideal type body, features into yoga. I must say that here I was particularly influenced by Joseph Alter for his work on Kushti wrestling as well as on yoga. But then there's also this phenomenon, this idea of Kalaria Payatu, which has a very different idea of the body, and Malakamba, Maharashtrian, etc. kind of way of athleticism. But I think one of the key things in terms of understanding how this new muscular body deviates from this is its functionality. In the pictures that I've added here, you see a particular kind of integration of the body with diet and otherwise that directly serves the sport. So if you're part of, an akada, which are gradually disappearing and being replaced by fitness centers because the younger generation is not that interested in anymore, it comes with a diet, a very specific ghee-rich, almond-rich diet that leads to a certain body that might still be muscular, but is not the kind of muscular body that we see on the cover of Men's Health. In all 3 cases, what you see is a body that has a certain functional use towards the sports. This is, of course, where bodybuilding and fitness deviate very markedly, because that functionality is not only not implied, it's also not of concern. It is a body that in the end exists to be evaluated for the body itself. That is the competition. And that also means that that body tells a different story. So if we then bring it all kind of to this book, Muscular India, you see that I try to touch upon 3 different elements in the book. One is masculinity. So what does it mean to be a male in India, in particular in this idea, this construct of a new India? Where do men exist? How do they stand out? What stories do they try to tell of themselves? And how can we also understand precarity through these stories, how they navigate urban change, urban developments, and all these kind of things that you see here in this collage of pictures. And then I also take seriously the concept of mobility, in particular mobility in the social and cultural variety. So I work a lot with Bourdieu, this notion of kind of being mobile, moving up the ladder, climbing within middle class ranks. One of the questions that I constantly return to in my work is how one moves up the ladder from being newcomers to middle class ranks, coming from vernacular backgrounds, and what it actually takes to be considered what I describe as upper middle class. What does it mean to pass? One of the examples I give from in the second chapter of the book, where we meet Supriya, one of the female clients of a gym that I did extensive field work in. She once told me that she's amazed by how the fitness trainers in the gym are able to mimic middle-class behavior. Mimicking has always stayed with me because it's kind of the meaning, isn't it, to suggest that it is mimicking. So what led her to phrase this as mimicking? And I interpreted that to her they hadn't quite crossed over yet. To her, it was still self-evident that where she came from was not where they come from. And that, as an anthropologist, I find these things very fascinating. But I also look at physical mobility and what it actually means to exist in the city. What does it mean to negotiate a city that is inherently unhealthy? I mean, Delhi right now is heading for a lockdown, not because of the pandemic, but because of air pollution conditions. What does it mean to promote stories of health, and how does one negotiate all these pitfalls of having to be in traffic all the time, having to spend massive amounts of time and energy negotiating it? And all this is ultimately an exploration of new middle class coming and new middle class formation. I think I'm going to stop here because usually there are quite a few questions by now, and I'll try to come back and circle back to some of the elements that I discuss in the book on the basis of the discussions to follow. Would that be okay, Pronta?
Michel, if there are like few slides, you may like continue.
Is that okay? I mean, I lost track of. So I'll just give you a brief glimpse of what the book is about. So usually so I'll do this briefly, but these are also elements we could talk about in the discussion, whether way. So the book starts in Mumbai, and it's situated at the first day of the final day of Ganesh Chaturthi, during which I follow two trainers, long-time informants, while we deliver one of these massive Ganpati Ganesha statues from the labor class neighborhood of Chembur to the Dada side. And what I try to do in the chapter is really also follow in their footsteps. And we have many discussions also what it means to be fitness trainers, like they are in different parts of the city where they on their motorcycles go from Chembur, for instance, to Malabar Hill or to Bandra West, much more affluent areas where they meet their clients and what it is they bring to the table. So the first chapter really tries to set that tone in particular, so that the reader also understands that what we embark on is a journey itself, where we need to traverse through different neighborhoods. And the central question in that chapter is, how do trainers from lower middle class backgrounds navigate the city? I then turn to Delhi, where I look into a small neighborhood gym located in GK in Delhi. And in it, we meet a couple of different trainers as well as clients coming together in a very small space, not a particularly well-equipped gym, but for some reason it holds local appeal among upper middle class Indians who themselves are quite wealthy in terms of landed property and otherwise. Most of the trainers come from Chirag, Delhi, a very different kind of sort of Delhi, which exists more or less in the shade of an immense complex of shopping malls. And I try to, in the chapter, understand how these different aspects of the city relate to each other and what kind of mobility is possible on the gym floor and outside. In the chapter, we then kind of look at trainers who are also bodybuilders in 2 different cities in the south, Chennai and Bangalore. The main question that the chapter is seeking to answer is what the body communicates, what it actually resonates with. And I kind of sort of building on Bourdieu, I introduced the concept of bodily capital as a way to understand what the body is worth. Obviously, this is a very expensive body. The bodies that you see here cost a lot of money, not just in terms of workout and diets, time and energy and gym memberships, but also in the use of anabolic steroids, growth hormones, proteins, supplements, and etc. So why would one actually want to invest in a body like that? And one of the central people in the chapter is an IT professional in Chennai who has no ambitions of actually becoming a fitness trainer. So the question I ask here is also why he would want to do what he does and take the kind of risks that he does. And this brings me to, I think, which is quite an important question when it comes to urban change in India, which is the question of a society on steroids itself. How does one negotiate the pitfalls of a middle-class lifestyle when one is upwardly mobile but can't rely on the kind of financial wealth and landed property that those from the second chapter do? What if one wants to establish oneself as middle class in a society where life is becoming more expensive, demands are becoming higher, questions of pollutions are becoming more important? So in it, I return to Chembur and to the informant of the first chapter, Kishore, to better understand how his ongoing life unfolds as a rather successful fitness trainer who is also shackled by burdens and who is also kind of dealing with getting older and maybe at some point has to face up that he will no longer look the way he once did. And I'm reminded a little bit of the guy here on the right, K11, which is a fitness institute which offers certification courses in Mumbai, and it's a very popular institute, which was formerly ran by Kazat Kapadia, and he actually passed away early this year. And this is another aspect that has characterized my fieldwork as well, that as much as we think of these bodies kind of as healthy, they're also bodies with significant health risks. And how does that actually work when you're working towards becoming bigger and more muscular? From there, we actually we travel to the outskirts of Delhi, the outskirts of NCR, and we engage with a Gujarat bodybuilding federation that I've been in contact with for quite a few years. And this chapter in particular tries to better understand sort of rural-urban divide in the context of New India. And as I show also in this chapter is that it's becoming increasingly hard to think of this divide as a clear-cut diet because of the way the city expands and the way formerly semi-rural communities become part of the city and become part of a narrative or a negotiation of who belongs to the city. And here I'm also particularly interested in how capital is valued and what particular capital is valued. So it looks a lot about into a well-off Gujarat community that at the same time is not valued for their social and cultural capital, and how do these negotiations take place within the city. The final chapter in the book, so basically before the conclusion, looks at same-sex desire and homoerotics through a class lens as well, in order to understand also how this body capital also resonates with an erotic or a sexual capital, and how that is consumed in a broader level. And this chapter in particular has recently resulted in in an academic publication with a journal called Porn Studies, of which I was also previously not aware it existed. It's a fascinating journal that specifically interrogates these questions. And for those of you interested in such topics, while the book kind of situates this into a story and never a narrative where we travel from one city to the next, the Porn Studies article, which I'm more than happy to share with you if you don't access, although I think it's actually open access right now, kind of draws comparisons with a number of case studies that all speak to the same predicament. And I'm looking forward to questions about this in particular. Let's see what comes up. So in conclusion, the book comes with an epilogue where you'll meet some of my informants again. I could easily write another epilogue post-pandemic now, because a lot of them have struggled quite hard with the pandemic, obviously. The book was published as narrative nonfiction, but I do think of it as an academic book. The reason I wanted to do it as a narrative nonfiction book is primarily because the disappointment that comes with academic publishing is that a book is often not very easily accessible and often also very expensive. But besides that, I was just also looking for a more rewarding discussion about the book, a book I've been working on for many years. And in that sense, I'm exceptionally looking forward to your questions and comments. So if not here, always feel free to write to me with questions, suggestions, queries. I'm always very happy to hear from people who've read the book. Over to you, Pranta.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michel. Now we have Mehul, who is doing his PhD on masculinity and media. He
Right,
has
sorry, yeah.
Mehul has to moderate the question answer session. Yeah, Mehul.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, thank you so much, sir, for that wonderful insight regarding masculinity in India. This session is now open for discussion. So, participants, you can unmute yourself and ask questions, or you may type your queries along with your name and institutional affiliation in the chat box, and I'll be happy to read out the questions for you guys. Bidu Bhushan, sir, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I beg apology to join late. It was a great session. I joined 15 minutes late. I beg apology for that. It was very wonderful session and very enriching session. Uh, uh, I have a question relating to methodology. As you mentioned, Michel, that it's a creative non-fiction and less academic or more creative non-fiction.
Yeah.
What you tell. So, by the way, can you just tell us exactly what kind of methodology you adopted and your engagement with Indian citizens or your subjects in India? So, we'll be happy to. I'll be happy to listen your engagement with the subjects in India.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Bidu. I mean, I'm not a very classical anthropologist, so a lot of my kind of field work, as I call it, are simply interviews. But there were a couple of distinct moments when I did my field work in a more participant observation manner. And one was when I spent a lot of time in one small gym in Delhi, and I was just by chance introduced to it. I didn't even know it existed. It was very close to the home I had at the time in CR Park. For those of you familiar in Delhi, this is in the south, a typical Bengali neighborhood. My friends is indeed a typical Bengali. And he said, why don't you check out this gym? Because I've heard good things about it. And that's how I ended up with it. You know, a lot of things in anthropology happen like that. Like somebody suggests, oh, you should really sort of stop by this place. And I walked into that place and I immediately realized that this is fascinating, because the way it was not a very well-equipped gym, but definitely one where I could immediately see people were walking in and out of being of different backgrounds. And that was what I was interested in already. That was also what I had applied with when Nalanda University asked me to join as a research fellow. They said, what do you want to do research on? And I said, well, I'm very interested in socioeconomic mobility, and I want to do this within this particular industry. And for that, you need to find a space to explore that at. But meanwhile, I had actually met quite a few people online already, because it was really through Om Shanti Om that I became fascinated by the topic, because it was such a media storm in India at the time, wasn't it? I mean, it was something that everybody could talk about, and it was something that in itself, I guess, provoked all sorts of questions about how Indians were looking upon themselves. And that spoke to me from the interviews that I read in newspapers, and when Times of India was dealing with it, or the Deccan Herald, or the Hindu, like, they were all writing about this. And obviously this, for me, always has a longer history. Like, I've been interested in the way that a kind of a new India has emerged in the global perception, the global imagination, since 1997, when India celebrated 50 years of independence. Because, as you may recall, that especially in international news, I used to work for a newspaper, for a magazine, a newspaper shop on the Central Station in Amsterdam as a student. This was the first time that magazines like Time and Newsweek started paying attention to kind of India emerging as an IT hub, and started crafting narratives that kind of situated India as moving from recently from a country shackled by all sorts of issues to an emerging power in the IT industry. And so part of it is, of course, also draws upon these questions, this longer term engagement, where one thing that I find interesting is how young Indians think about these topics themselves and relate to that, but also how they negotiate kind of sort of an outside world versus an inside world, sort of, what is expected from home in terms of marriage and lifestyles, and how do you then step out of your home and work for a multinational company, or go to a gym like Fitness First, or I don't know, I probably deviated from your question on methodology a little bit here. That so a lot of the ways that my informants often describe my way of working as being on the couch. So I let them talk for hours on end, and it's often the very first time that I get to do so. So it almost feels like being on the couch at a psychiatrist's office, where you can just talk about yourself. And this is what helps me create a narrative. Sorry, Bidu. I mean, I probably, sort of mumbled along too long.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sir, we have a question in the chat box. Rajat Suvramandal from the university, from Raiganj University, asks that Lord Ganesha embodies everything that hegemonic masculinity does not. So don't you think Lord Ganesha celebration is ironic in that regard?
Oh, yes, 100%. I fully agree. But you know what? That year that I did that fieldwork, was it the year after that? Because I've been part of a couple of these celebrations. There was actually in one of the shopping malls in Mumbai, there was a kind of sort of a hologram projection of Lord Ganesha, where instead of giving him offerings, you could cycle. So you would be on a fitness cycle. And the idea was that the god would become more muscular if you cycled faster. So there is definitely a different way of thinking about that. And even in gyms, and I've come across this in quite a few places, Lord Ganesha has become quite a bit more muscular than we recall him from the good old days, when he was simply, holding up his favorite sweet that you eat during Ganesh Chaturthi, and it being a pot-belly god. But this resonates also with a particular idea of masculinity and kind of health and fitness that is an older middle class ideal. So you'll recall that in the older days, the idea of the the healthy pot belly spoke to well-being, wealth itself. And this has changed, right? With this new bodily ideal, this is no longer. Now it's the app that speaks to that. Whereas only 20 years ago, this would remind us of hard labor. I mean, who had six-pack abs? That would be your cycle wala in Calcutta, but not, or your construction worker. He would be the one who needed muscles, but a person belonging to a middle-class family working as a doctor or an accountant, would you ever imagine that person needing six packs for anything? So there you go.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions, participants? I think Pranta sir wants to ask a question here.
Yeah. So since there are no questions coming, I thought that I just pop in between. While I was reading the book, Michelle, like I had a lot of questions, and I have marked few of them in the book itself. Uh, and one of them is like I felt like I was talking to you, like while reading this book, and I was going through the gullies of Mumbai and the Ganesh Chaturthi. So you have very well captured that, and I felt that I was traveling along with you in the through this book.
I'm so happy to hear that.
And my question is, when we are talking about a new urban India, like is it like the caste is somehow missing conspicuously, or is it like a deliberate attempt to not talk about caste? Because there are very few instances of caste, but very sparsely touched. Like, and that is what made me think like, are we talking about a new urban India in terms of a casteless society when we are talking about this gym trainers? Okay, and when we are talking about upward mobility for this gym trainers, is it something similar to Sanskritization that M.N. Srinivas talks about, or is it something else when we are talking about a different kind of a class mobility? So where is caste in all this discussion? That is what I was like, I was
Yeah.
grappling with. So that troubled me a lot. And the second question is, when you are talking about the relationship of trust between the client and the trainer in page number 137, where I have marked it. Now, this trust between the client and the trainer, does it bridge the gap between the in the class relationship between the client and the trainer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, desperately, sort of looking up what 137 was about. I'll probably recognize it easily. Yeah.
The I can read it like it says that they presented themselves as reliable, whereas all these others were cheaters. As such, they
Oh, God,
offered
yes.
trust and confidence. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that relationship between the client and the trainer, uh, this relationship of trust, did it bridge the gap, the class gap between them? Yeah, these
Yeah.
are the two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, to quickly think, because a couple of trust issues, and I just had a reporter ask me about something related to that quite differently in terms of relationships between female clients and fitness trainers. So for a second, I thought that this is what you were referring to. Let me turn to the question of caste first. I mean, I've had this question before, and the reason I navigated with probably a lot of subtlety, but also I wouldn't say circumvented a little bit, is the important thing is to understand that this is a book that is situated in 4 large cities, and we often have a tendency to reduce caste to something very clear cut, right? Like especially in Western scholarship, it always becomes about these 4 varnas, like, and so whereas we all know in practice that there are countless different jatis that are not mutually comparable, that have their own histories, also their own contested histories, even within the larger reservation system or hierarchically within Tamil Nadu. I mean, you have the the Brahmins as Ayers and Iyengars, but the relationship with Mudaliars as Kshatriyas is not that clear cut. So the risk you always have by thinking that you understand it all is that you start reducing it to bite size that you can quickly communicate to the audience at large, whereas in practice, you're actually making a faux pas of some sort. You're making a mistake. So what I decided to do is I left it out of most of the equations, whereas obviously it always plays some part. But I only decided to do so when I felt I could actually make a point. So there is one chapter on Delhi, which is very much about Gujar and Jat communities. And there I thought, okay, if I can do this in one chapter, in one regional context of which I feel that I can make a point that makes sense. And the chapter, as you may recall, is very much about how Delhi itself functions as a construct within NCR, within the National Capital Region, and the way the city kind of sort of expands and swallows up farmland and folds in kind of formerly rural communities that have landed on new well. And these are actually communities historically also associated with Pelwani wrestling and with bigger bodies through diet and all. And there is a caste influence to be delineated that can be explained. But I was a little hesitant doing it elsewhere because, as I described earlier, it felt like a trap almost. Like I know caste relations quite well in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. I can describe to them in the context of Bangalore or Chennai or but doing so with the kind of sort of subtlety, sophistication they require, this wasn't the book to do that. At the same time, when you suggest that India is heading for a casteless society, I think what we're seeing now is that class increasingly becomes an aspect that also determines your place. And this new generation of new middle-class Indians often come from intermediate caste backgrounds, and to them it is less important, I would say, because they often don't know of each other. Also because surnames tend to be quite general. It matters a lot less. Socioeconomics matter more, but we should never forget that caste does play a part in class ordering and hierarchy. So a person belonging to the upper middle classes, growing up, speaking English, going to the better schools, usually relies on an upper caste background, which it's not that it paved the way to get in the door through caste, but because he grew up in a family that already was banking on a certain privilege. And this is the thing I'm more interested in than the specifics of purity or does that make sense? Because other than that, you asked me something on kind of sort of trust, and I think this speaks more to how one can actually understand what is going on in Indian urban space. And it always feels strange to explain that to you guys. You guys are in Jaipur, or
yeah.
India, with 1.3 billion strong, is soon to be the most populous nation on earth. It's also one of the bigger nations. It's also one of the more powerful nations. And I would add, logically, it's also one of the more complex nations with many different language varieties. But I think what makes India even more difficult to navigate, even for average Indians, for Indians like you guys, is that cities are developing so fast, so rapidly, that you often don't quite know what's going on. And this also has to do with the complexity of regional parties, regional interests, and all these other things. And I think you need to understand this thing of uncertainty as also being about that, about this kind of distrust also resonates with a certain distrust that a lot of Indians have with Indian cities. I mean, my family also lives in Bangalore, so I'm speaking partly through the fact that I also have in-laws in Bangalore, and so that kind of relationships is unstable. It's not always. I mean, you feel proud of India, but at the same time, you feel a certain amount of distrust towards ownership of knowing how things develop. So page 137 is, I guess, partly about that as well. Sorry, I'm going on way too long. I can talk about this forever.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, I got it. Thank you.
So we have few questions in the chat box. Dr. Kaushik N. Bhuna, who is an assistant professor at ASBM University, he has two questions for you. First, he asks that in the changing world, talking about male gaze and class prejudice, is money stronger than morality or the ethics of these middle class bodybuilders? And secondly, he wants to know if, okay, you can answer the first one and then I'll put the second one in front of you.
Yeah, shall I do that? Yeah, as an anthropologist, I'm always a bit wary of this either or thing. I think a lot of fitness trainers and bodybuilders that I met work with a strong sense of morality. I mean, one of the questions I often get is if they are like extremists in a certain doctrine or religious belief, and you'll find that many of them actually rather open-minded and in that sense even celebrating all the diversity that is inherent to India. But of course, when it comes to money in the body and what people try to achieve, bodybuilding as a sport itself is not, you can't be competitive without investing in your body also by means of hormones, growth hormones, steroids. It's part of the sports, but it never quite happens without a sense of morality. It is always a negotiation. It's always a decision. It's always a health question as well. As most of us do things that are unhealthy to our body. In the end, what is always necessary, though, is that people need to go to the gym, no matter what you do.
So he also wants to know if you plan to pen anything in future about female muscularity.
Yes, actually, I'd love that. I'd love that because I've a couple of my informants. I mean, I couldn't make it work in this book, and in the end, I decided to. Already, this book touches upon way too much. So if I touched upon that as well, but I'd love to do a piece actually on female bodybuilding because that's been growing really rapidly in India in recent years, and I actually hope that there will be a PhD student who is willing to do some research on this. I would love to be a supervisor of that or an advisor or whatever, because it's a big thing, because it comes with very, very different types of questions. And in the epilogue of the book, I speak a little bit about that because one of my informants is one of India's most renowned bodybuilders, and yeah, obviously the questions are very different, but I think it's a very powerful topic. So if any of you wants to do research on this, let me know.
So we have.
What is can I ask you a question, Mel? Because you mentioned that you were doing work on. Can you tell me what your work on masculinity is about?
So basically, I'm trying to explore how media texts, particularly I'm working on soap operas. So how soap operas explore the idea of masculinity, because soap operas, as we generally understand, is a woman-centric genre, also in terms of audiences as well as the content or the narratives of such shows.
Yeah,
So how do these shows project the idea of masculinity? Do they like adhere to the
excellent.
conservative traditional hegemonic idea, or are they more open and they are ready to project newer masculinities, whether they at all believe in the plurality of masculinity or not? So these are things that I'm exploring through my study.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, well, a fantastic topic.
So we have one more question in the chat
Sure.
box. Um, Tizubi Mapopo from Keat University wants to know if cultural barriers were which hindered you from feeling unpacking issues of sexuality mentioned in the last chapter of your book.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there are always cultural barriers. I'm a white Dutch man, so I'm often in contexts where I am the outsider, where I don't speak the language, where I don't, clearly stand out as a person. I mean, in 2 decades of being in India, living in India, having friends in India, I mean, this is something that I've gotten quite used to over time. But I mean, the last chapter is also about how my gay friends respond to my research topic and the inherent eroticism in there. And I'm gay myself, and my partner is originally Indian, as I speak also in the book about. So yeah, this comes with certain ideas of why one might be engaged in a research topic like this. And I've tried to use all that discomfort that question would bring with it to interrogate actually what my research topic symbolized, and what the men who are my informants, how they are part of social media space, how they advertise themselves, and what kind of stories they're telling about themselves. So yes, I was always the other person in the room. At the same time, I navigated these different scapes where, on the one hand, in a bodybuilding competition, attending that and being friends with the juries, it usually means that I'm the only Western person in the room amidst thousands, so I easily stand out. At the same time, when I navigate these spaces that I share with my friends, it becomes about a different question altogether. And I've always thought, like, as an anthropologist, the good thing is when that happens, as uncomfortable as it can be super uncomfortable to be the other in the room, right? The person who doesn't know the language. I mean, I did research in 4 different cities. I don't speak Tamil. My Hindi is rather rudimentary. Most of my research was conducted in English. I've always been very honest about that. That when I was in Nalanda University, I spent a lot of time in Bihar. I mean, for that occasion, I couldn't become fluent in Bihari, but I still wanted to know stuff of young Biharis. So, I've learned to kind of turn that into a strength rather than a weakness. So instead of constantly thinking I don't know something, or I'm the other, or I'm not, how can I kind of sort of invert these questions to answer certain questions that I have about Indian society or the fieldwork that I'm engaging in. But there's always a negotiation. There's always something you don't get. I've had lengthy conversations with Joseph Alter about this, who's absolutely famous for his work on Kushti, wrestling, and otherwise. And we also agreed, yes, you always make choices. This is anthropology, and you can't please all.
Okay, so are there any more questions? Anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask anything? Okay, so there are no more questions. So finally, sir, I would like to pitch in a question from my own end.
Sure.
Sir, I read your book, so I understand when you're talking about these lower middle class bodybuilders and then looking for upwards mobility. But as far as the clients are concerned, or an average Indian upper middle class person, specifically men I'm talking about in this context, what are they looking for? I understand, like you mentioned about perseverance and a lot of work on the body and dedication and passion. But coming to the last chapter of your book, is it also about generating some sort of desirability about themselves, or some sort of sexual attraction that they want to create about their own bodies? And thus, are they also looking for some sort of mobility, if not in economic terms, then in terms of their body as a power or as an agency? Yes, if you could elaborate about that.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're on to something important, which could could actually be a next book almost, or a next article, or maybe something you could look into. And I'd be very keen to hear what you find out about this. But yes, of course. I mean, as always, the body is never just that what we think it is. We all have one. So let's start. That's a starting position, right? We all have a body. We will always have a body till the moment we get cremated or otherwise. Before that, that body also always tells a story of what we've done with it. We've been too thin, we've grown fat, we've transformed it, etc. So I like to think of it as a text, as a story. And when it comes to sexual attractiveness, we have a tendency to reduce that also exactly to this, right? To the cover, this particular guy. But this exists in a myriad of different forms of muscularity as well, and it can be quite subtle where the line is what we consider attractive, and when it becomes too big or too grotesque, or it starts signaling something else. And what is interesting about that is that is often not necessarily just about the physical, but also what it communicates with, what it responds to. So when we talk about upper middle class clients wanting to become more attractive because this is what Bollywood, Hollywood, Tollywood says, you should look like, we should also keep in mind that even within these movies, there are countless different forms that not just the Khans or any other actor has showcased. It's always layered differently. And the thing I'm trying to say is that, yes, they might have that as a motive to go to the gym, but it's always about something else as well. That if there's one thing that my research had taught me, it's always about more than just one thing. Looking sexually attractive, looking healthy, looking professional, looking cosmopolitan, they can all sort of exist side by side. They talk, they conflate, but they are never just one thing. Does that answer your question at all?
Yes, to a lot of extent.
Okay.
Thank you. So, since there are no more questions, I would like to invite Dr. Anup Kumar, Assistant Professor of the CMS Department, to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mehul. Thank you, Dr.Michiel Baas, sir, for accepting our invitation to talk about your book, Muscular India. Thank you very much, sir. Again, I thank all faculties, research scholars, students from Central University of Rajasthan and other educational institutions for joining this book discussion program. Thank you all once again. Over to you, Mehul.
Yeah, and we should also thank Mehul for wonderfully moderating this session.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. So with this, we come to an end, and I hope to see all of you in the next session. Thank you so much, sir, for joining, and I look forward to writing to you and knowing about your work.
Yeah,
and discussing more questions if possible.
You can find my profile, because some of the people have asked me for my email address. It's fairly easily available on my Max Planck Institute address. So if you just type in my name, you should be able to find it very easily. Otherwise, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, so it shouldn't be hard.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for joining our book discussion. And hopefully we'll meet soon with another new book for discussion. Thank you, Michelle.
Perfect.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.